Starting a little bit late, technical difficulties, so it's just how it is. So welcome back to Rocky Christie, the place where you come to learn how to think logically and how to defend the Christian faith. My name is Forrest DeVita, for those of you that are new and don't know me. I'm one of the chapter directors here at NC State. There are hundreds of Rocky Christie chapters. This is just one of them. And my co-director is Julian. Hello. Hey. Okay, so this is actually a bigger turnout than I expected, given what we're talking about tonight, which is really just logic. So something that is kind of the bread and butter of Christian apologetics. Something that you really need to know is how to think logically, not only for being able to build your own arguments for the defense of the Christian faith, but also to be able to analyze and tear down arguments against it. And so logic is unfortunately one of those things that is not often taught in schools, especially public schools. Those of you that are homeschooled, you may have gotten some of it, probably in your apologetics courses. But so it's unfortunately something that's not taught. And so when you decide that you need to or want to learn how to think more logically, what are your actual choices, right? So you can, in college, take some formal logic classes. Those are a little less than fun. Or you can do things like, read some textbooks on logic, or watch some Khan Academy or something like that. All of it that's just kind of very boring and abstract, right? And so, because it goes over things like, if it is raining outside, the ground will be wet. If it's raining outside, therefore the ground will be wet. It's just kind of like dumb. Helps you understand it, but it's very dumb. So what I hope to do tonight is to teach a little bit of both formal and informal logic, and we'll talk about the distinctions between those two. But do it in a way that's a little more interesting, a little more applicable, because what we'll be doing is we'll be analyzing different objections or arguments against the Christian faith and talking about what logical errors are made in there. So, sound good? So going through I don't know, 15 of them or something like that. And I'm going to have to write them on the board because it's not working. I also do not remember what order I put those things in. Okay, as a reminder, next week we're talking about the defense of the Trinity. I think Sarah, wherever Sarah is, there she is, we'll be talking about that. And we'll have a primer for that at the very end. Okay, so there's two types of logical fallacies. I mentioned formal and informal. Formal logical fallacies deal with how arguments themselves are structured, as well as which is really just the inference from one premise to the next premise to the conclusion. Right? So it's mistakes made in that. It's very mathematical in its formulation. Informal logical fallacies don't deal so much with the structure of arguments, but they deal with the content of the arguments. And so we'll be covering a good bit of both of those, so you'll get a feel for it. Okay, so the first one is the objection that, the authors of both the Old and New Testament, particularly the Old Testament, were really just illiterate Bronze Age goat herders, right? And so how can we really trust anything that they say? Have you guys kind of heard, it's a popular kind of objection on atheist or skeptic forums. So thoughts on that? They're just Bronze Age goat herders, so how can we trust what they say?
They're strawmanning, they're using the strawman on the Bible.
What's a strawman?
They're not attacking the credibility of the author rather than the work itself. Okay.
So that could be a straw man, right? And there's another one. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be an ad hominem?
Ad hominem, where you're attacking the person rather than
I'm just
content.
going off what he said.
Yeah. So those are similar. Anything else that this could fall under? One of you, you can fight it out.
Are you looking for a specific type of thing, or just
Oh, just if anyone happens to know what kind of fallacy this is. If not, I'm going to tell you anyway. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be, excuse me, chronological snobbery? It's old, so therefore it's bad.
Close. Yeah.
It's also not true.
It's also not true, yeah. Davis?
That's what I thought.
Okay. So what this is, more specifically, is what's called a genetic fallacy, which an ad hominem is close but not quite there. So what a genetic fallacy does is it attacks the source of, or like it attacks how you came to a belief rather than the credibility of the belief itself. And so this belief came from, let's say, even if we grant that they're just Bronze Age goat herders, right? What this objection is saying is that, well, because it came from Bronze Age goat herders, therefore it's not true, right? But Bronze Age goat herders can say things that very well are true, right? If they have good reasons for believing it, right? Like they can argue for things just as well as we can nowadays, right? Like if they give the same exact argument as we do now, the fact that they're Bronze Age goat herders has nothing really to do with it, right? And so that's what we call the genetic fallacy. Okay, next one. The fact that a human being has to tell you about the existence of your God proves that there's no God to begin with.
Hasn't a human being told us about the existence of everything else?
Yep, that's true. Right? So that's a way to approach that, saying, well, look, that same standard doesn't apply to everything else that you believe, right? So like everyone has to tell us about something, right? That is proof that all those things don't exist. But there's a more fundamental reason, why this argument fails.
I mean, just generally, how do you know that? How do you know God wouldn't tell us that he exists on his own?
Sure.
Is it a genetic fallacy again?
No, so this one's a non sequitur. So the actual conclusion that the argument is coming to, you can't actually arrive from there logically from the premises, right? Like it's going from someone has to tell you that this is true to therefore it's not true, right? That doesn't follow from the premise. Make sense? So non sequitur. Man, it is dead quiet here. We are in the butt crack of NC State. Just,
butt crack.
Seriously, it's like we're underground. All right. Alright, next one. Seriously, you have to take care of it. Alright. Okay, so next one. And Blaney went. Alright, there was no time before the Big Bang. So that means that there was no time for a God to exist in or create things in.
What if God exists outside of time?
Okay. So, yes.
It's assuming that one thing is true and that the other one can't be true, and also just that one thing is true and the other one isn't. Like
What do you mean?
Like it's arguing that everything is going according to the theory, so the Big Bang theory. It's according to it's assuming that everything about that is true and that nothing else outside.
Sure. So let's take the Big Bang out of it. So there was no time before everything existed, right? So that means that there was no time for God to exist in or create things in. So just take the whole idea of the Big Bang out. Julia.
Seems like a category error.
Not quite.
Okay.
So
Is it begging the question?
Glenn, there's a reason I said you'd like this one.
I feel like what Lydia said was spot on, because we assume that God can exist out of time, outside of
Right.
time.
So what did she point out? That what they assume, or what, in their argument, what they're assuming about God isn't actually what we believe about God, right?
Yeah.
So what would you call that? When you assume something incorrectly about someone's beliefs and then attack that rather than what they actually believe?
Strawman fallacy?
That's the straw man.
Oh, okay.
Yes, there it is. All right. That's the straw man fallacy.
Okay.
Right? They're not actually attacking the idea of the Christian God. They're attacking an idea of a faulty idea of the Christian God, setting that up as a straw man and then knocking that over and being like, look, I win. Right? So no, because Christians historically believe that God is necessarily exists outside of time, or fundamentally exists outside of time. Not necessarily. And so to say that, well, look, he existed in time, yeah, he existed in time to create things, but there was no time, so therefore it can't work. That just doesn't work for us, right? There. All right. You'll like this one. There's a pattern here now. Okay. So there is no evidence for God. is what a lot of people will say, right? That one's incredibly common. And so, as a bit of a hint, what they really mean by this, or often, what they often mean, not always, but what they often mean is that there's no physical evidence for God. Now, this one's a little harder to see, but this is actually a case of what's called begging the question. So begging the question is when you assume that the very thing you're trying to prove, and then argue from that. It's also called circular reasoning, right? So begging the question, circular reasoning. So the reason this is begging the question is because when someone says, there's no evidence for God, what they mean is usually there's no physical evidence for God, right? Which assumes that you need to have physical evidence for it, to prove anything, which is really just begging the question for naturalism, right? So saying that, because if the natural world is all that exists, right, there is no supernatural stuff. And even if there is supernatural stuff, you're not going to expect physical evidence for it. And so when someone says, well, I need physical evidence for this non-physical thing, right, it's assuming that, yes?
Is it the same sort of idea that, like, even if no one believes or knows that something is true, if it is true, then it's still true? Like you don't need evidence for something to be true, even if it's like.
So that's a slightly different idea. But I guess it could be related to this. What you're talking about, I think, is the difference between epistemology and ontology, where epistemology is how you come to know something, right? But then ontology is what there actually is out there to know. And so it's the old riddle, before Mount Everest was discovered, what was the tallest mountain in the world? The answer is still Mount Everest. We just didn't know it at the time. Doesn't change the fact that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain. Whether or not we thought it was K2 or something else doesn't really matter. We were just wrong. Right? Okay. Christians only believe in Christianity because they were born in a Christian culture. If they'd been born in India, they would have been Hindu instead.
There are people who are born in India that are Christians.
Yep, so that's one way to go about it. So that's their, what you're doing is reducing their argument to absurdity a little bit, right?
Yeah.
But what I want to do is, which is a valid way of arguing against it, what I want to do is actually point out the logical fallacy in there.
I mean, is it kind of like the bandwagon, where just because everybody's one thing, you follow along with it?
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about the populist fallacy, where just because something's popular, therefore it's true, which is a little different than this. Yes?
I don't know the name of it, but it's like you're just making a generalization about something like a blanket statement.
Overgeneralization?
Sure.
Not quite.
I don't remember lots of fallacies.
No, you're right. So this one's the genetic fallacy again. So some of these are related. They're saying, well, look, just because you were born somewhere, so it's kind of like almost the inverse of the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy says, because of where this belief came from, it's true or false, right? But it's saying, well, because you grew up in a culture where Christianity is common, of course you're going to believe Christianity, and it completely regards things like what Blaine was talking about, where in the Hindu cultures you have people who become Christians. They probably do it, or some of them, because of the evidence, right, and go against their culture. So it completely ignores all of that. Yeah.
This is more of like a general question, but when trying to convince someone of something, like let's say like the physical evidence of Christianity and stuff like that, do you find that it's better to use the kind of logic that like you're using with like, it has names and like going after like logical fallacies, or do you think it's better to like the kind of logic we saw earlier where it's almost like reducing their argument to absurdity? Like, which do you
It
think is
depends.
better?
So more so the second one, the reducing to absurdity. But knowing how to break down people's arguments into their different premises and pick those apart is important more so for you than it is for evangelism. So if I'm sitting there, talking to someone, like I'm out tabling doing evangelism, something like that, I'm very rarely going to say like, oh, well, you just committed the genetic fallacy. I mean, it'd be very good in like a debate context, but just one-on-one, like odds are they don't even know what that is to begin with, right? And so it's much easier to do what, has anyone heard of a guy named Francis Schaeffer? before. So he came a little bit before our time. He was more popular in like the 70s. But what he would do is he would very gently take the roof off people's houses, right? So basically he would show that given what you currently believe, these are the absurd ramifications of your beliefs. And so, but you should obviously reject. And so therefore you should reject the starting point that brought you to this crazy absurd place, right? And actually sitting there and walking someone through that process by asking them questions, that kind of thing, that's a really good way to do it. And so I think Tactics is a book by Greg Kogel, does a really good job of teaching you how to do that.
Sorry, I have one more
No, you're
question.
fine.
This stuff is really interesting to me. So, is there a name for like when someone believes one thing and then they believe another thing, but those two things can't like exist together?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a name for like that kind of like breaking that down, or that kind of like fallacy of like you're more like you say you're this, but you believe in this kind of thing?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple ways to answer that. So there's a name for the feeling that people get when they hold two contradictory beliefs. We call that cognitive dissonance. But that's only if they actually recognize that. But is there a name for that? I mean, really, that's reductio ad absurdum, which is really just taking someone's belief system and revealing contradictions within it. That's the closest to like a formal name you really get. Unless anyone else can think of an actual formal name.
Go with sibling rivalry and tactics by Gregory Kugel.
Hmm?
Would that go with sibling rivalry?
What is sibling rivalry?
It's sort of what she was saying when someone holds two opposing ideas together and then they can't coexist. It doesn't make sense. One has to be true, one can't be true.
Right, or both have to be false.
Okay.
Yes.
How do you go about like walking through that process? Because some things, like some people will believe, are contradictory, but are in fact not. Like, for example, saying God is a good God, and then people saying, well, pain exists, why, and evil exists, why is a good God allow that to happen?
Mm-hmm.
So to their view, that would be two contradictory things. How would you like walk through, like not that specific instance, but
I mean,
just
that was
like
specifically in my slides, but
how would you walk through like specifically determining when it is contradictory and when not? Do you just
determining when it is contradictory?
Yeah, like when is it reductio ad absurdum, and when is it like not actually contradictory? Like how do you, is there a process you go to come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I'm trying to fully understand the question. So I mean, learning how to recognize when two things are contradictory, that's, like, when you write it down on paper, it's pretty easy to see, right? But then in a conversation, it's something that you more gain from just experiencing, because as you're talking to someone, you try to remember all the different things that they actually believe, right? And then after a while, you begin, like a lot of times you don't even do it in the conversation itself. A lot of the time, this is like a lot of reflection that happens after conversations where you sit, like, have you ever like had an argument with someone and then you're in the shower that night and you're like, oh, I should have said this instead?
Yes, a lot.
Right, yeah. So like, if you only ever talk to one person, you know, you're gonna talk to that person, argue with them, get in the shower, and be like, oh, I should have said this. But then it's too late by that point. But by the point you've talked to like 100 different people, you begin to see patterns emerge in what people believe, right? Because there's not that many people that actually believe very unique things, especially in our culture. A lot of people just tend to believe the same general group of stuff. And so you can remember back to, oh, well, here's a previous conversation I had with someone who believed these same kind of things. I bet this is where they're going with this. And so what you can do is recognize that, you know, where they're going, and you can use questions to guide the conversation to lead them to that point, right, where you know you can actually draw out a contradiction that you've recognized ahead of time from a previous conversation. So that's the way I usually do it. It's like, look, I know probably what this person believes, and so I'm going to, you know, ask them probing questions to ensure that actually is what they believe, and then bring them to where I know a contradiction already lies. So I don't have to like think of where the contradiction is in real time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And a lot of that just comes with practice and like just experience talking to people. I like how this turned into a talk on practical like evangelism as an apologist, which I also have a talk for, but.
I could be wrong, but I think that, I'm not quite sure, but like the way I understood the question was more of like if these people, like these questions are directed at, say, you know, a person, and they're accusing them of being contradictory. However, like, I think it's more like, how do you deal with you being like, oh, okay, that's contradictory versus your statement accusing of being contradictory being a logical fallacy, if that makes sense.
I don't think I follow. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I have trouble explaining things.
Hey, does anyone else, I'm also sleep deprived, so it's not my fault. Does anyone else have a different way of explaining that my tired brain can understand? Alright, well, we carry on. We can talk more afterwards if you want, but maybe you can just flesh it out a little bit more. And I don't really put you on the spot here. Okay, next one. Someone says, okay, well, you say that God is infinite. However, you also say that an actual infinite can't exist. So isn't that contradictory? Right? An actual infinite can't exist, and yet God is infinite. Maybe you guys can tell me how you would answer this one, and then we can actually explain what the fallacy is.
Isn't that like the exception proves the rule?
No. If we're going to say an actual infinite can't exist, then that's full stop. Yes?
I mean, I'm just gonna shoot a shot here, but I would say that, or one would say that because, you know, God exists outside of the space-time continuum, space itself can't be infinite, but God exists outside of that. So something along those lines.
Okay. What do we mean when we say God is infinite? When people say it. It's not something I personally say, because I think it's very unclear what I actually mean it. But when people do say it, like if you were to say it, what are you actually getting at?
More like God is everywhere and everything.
Okay.
He's outside of time.
So when you say that God is infinite, you mean God is outside of time?
Yeah, he's not limited by the things in our universe.
Okay, so he's unrestrained.
Yeah.
I was going to say he's not limited by any of the dimensions that we experience. He's outside of all of them.
Okay. So we're getting unrestrained and unlimited. But like to not have limits. It's a little different than infinite. Yes?
And whenever I think of him being infinite, I think he's like undying, he's everlasting, like I don't know, like to add on to theirs, I mean, there's no limits on him in any sort of way. He created all things.
Sure. I'll say this in a philosophically, well, called robust way. When I think that what people are trying to get at when they say God is infinite is that he's the greatest he possibly could be in all of his great making attributes. Right? So when it comes to his power, he's, he can do all things logically possible. He's omniscient, so he knows all true propositions, that kind of thing. And so God, when we say that God is infinite, we mean it more in a qualitative sense of the word, where when we say that an actual infinite cannot exist, we mean that in a more of a quantitative sense of the word, right? Dealing with like counting of things. Things like, we think of Hilbert's Hotel, an infinite number of hotel rooms can't actually exist. What we're talking about there is numbers. None of you really said anything when it came to God being infinite about numbers, right? Because we're not really talking quantity when we say God's infinite, we're talking quality. And so what this argument does is it equivocates between two different definitions of the word infinite, right? And so equivocation happens when an argument uses an ambiguous term, and then in the same argument uses different definitions of that term, or uses that term in different ways, in such a way that it pits them against each other. But in an argument, you actually have to be consistent in the way that you're using words throughout. Yeah?
Could you say that, like, God is immeasurable, therefore we don't speak of him infinitely in a quantitative sense because we can't?
I mean, what do you mean by immeasurable? If you mean by immeasurable, like, hey, he's not physical, and therefore you can't physically measure him.
Like, there's nothing to count about him, so you wouldn't use numbers in the first place.
I mean, that's true, yeah.
Okay.
Though technically there are some things to count about him, but even those, it's not infinite.
Right.
See you next week for that. Yeah, all right. Okay. Any questions on the equivocation? Cool. Okay. You've probably heard something similar to this before. If God performed a miracle in front of me, then I would believe in him. Right? That's what people say. But usually this is from someone who doesn't already believe in him. So what they're really saying is, if God performed a miracle in front of me, then I believe in him. However, he has not performed a miracle in front of me, so therefore I won't believe in him. Right? Yes?
That's the idea that you can't see something, then whenever it isn't like, it's not real or different.
Sure. I mean, that may be an underlying base that they have, yeah. It's like, I need to see it to believe it.
It's like circular reasoning, because if you believe that God did a miracle in front of you, you would first have to believe that he exists, because he has to be the one doing the miracle.
A miracle could convince you that he exists, right? If all of a sudden the sky opened up and God appeared and like started talking, things like that. Okay. Even people that didn't believe in him ahead of time, they do now. Yeah. Yeah.
Is that forming truth based off of your subjective experience instead of like an objective reality?
Not quite. I mean, even them. I think if God performed a miracle in front of you, that's part of objective reality, and so you'd be forming a belief based off that. This is actually an example of a formal logical fallacy.
Similar to that, like they're limiting, like God has already performed miracles in the presence of other people, but like you're limiting like valid evidence to like things that are only performed in front of you, which doesn't really like prove God's existence any more than him doing a miracle in front of all the other people.
Okay.
Like, what basis is there for limiting the evidence to only things that you can physically see?
Would it be a genetic fallacy?
Forrest, since you brought
Yes.
up the board, you mind if I turn the lights up?
Not at all. You guys see that? My chicken scratch?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So, remember how I mentioned that, you guys in the back see that? Awesome. Remember how I mentioned that formal logical fallacies are kind of mathematical in structure and really formalized, right? So, so I'm going to explain a little bit about logical syntax. Okay, so the way that arguments are formalized in logic is they use symbols. And so a very common symbol is the symbol P. The symbol P just stands for some preposition, right? A preposition is just a statement about, about reality, right? Like, it's like the walls are white, it's raining outside, I'm wearing a red shirt, God exists. All those are different prepositions. And prepositions can be either true or false. Okay. This here represents like if then. And so it's saying, if God performs a miracle, then I'll believe it. And so this is, me breaking down this guy's claim into the actual logical structure. Right? And so the other side so the first side of the if is the P, and then a common symbol for the other side is Q. P stands for reposition, Q is just the thing that comes after P. That is just how it is. Okay, and so we can represent the preposition that God performs a miracle as P, and therefore I believe as Q, right? And so this says if P, then Q. Follow? Okay, and so God does not perform a miracle. This is not P. Right? It's just the negation of P, and this whole symbol means negation. For those of you in electrical or computer engineering, it's also sometimes written like this, where there's a little bar above the P. Right? But both of those are Did someone say tilde?
Tilde.
Tilde, like, what, like that? Yeah.
Yeah.
I've never seen that one. Okay, so, which one, what's, discipline's that?
Well, I guess it's computer engineering, and Verilog specifically.
Oh, okay, sure, all right.
Also,
They also teach it in logic class, so.
Do they
it's
still
definitely
do
valid.
Yeah, I've always, back in my day, it was this symbol here.
Show his age.
Yeah. Okay, so not P, and then here, this is not Q. Q is I believe, therefore I don't believe, not believing, not Q. Okay, so a valid way of reasoning is this. If P, then Q, right? P, therefore Q. Make sense?
No.
So like, let's say, if it is raining outside, the grass will be wet. It's raining outside, therefore the grass is wet. Okay, this, this right here, this is the, what's called the antecedent. And this here is called the consequent. That'll come up later. It also helps explain what the name of this fallacy is. Antecedent consequent. Anyone care to guess what this fallacy is called? You'll notice it's not structured like this. This structure is if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q.
well, the correct structure should be not Q implies not P.
That is true.
But
Yes.
the converse is not necessarily true.
That's true. Oh, yes.
Deny the antecedent?
This is denying the antecedent, right? So the mistake they make is denying the antecedent P, and then from there inferring not Q. This is not actually correct. The reason why is, like, let's think about the it's raining and the grass being wet example. In this case, if it is raining, the grass is wet. But then if you say, well, it's not raining and therefore the grass is not wet, there could very well be many other reasons the grass is wet, right? Someone could have their sprinklers on. There could be a toddler crying over the grass. A dog could have peed on the grass, right? A bunch of things that don't rely on it raining for it to, the grass to be wet. And so here, this performs that, or this commits that fallacy. Joel? Yeah.
So like when they say, when they verbally say that God performs a miracle, then I will believe. Like what if they're trying to say that God performs a miracle, I will believe only if God performs a miracle. And so like it's an if and only if kind of deal. Like what if like they might not be saying that directly, but like they might be implying that in what they're saying.
Right. So for this particular argument, it is slightly contrived.
Yeah.
Right. It is slightly contrived to tell drive home a point. But if someone says, I'll only believe if and only if God performs a miracle in front of me. In that case, that's not so much a logical fallacy as it is someone just setting the bar a little too high.
Okay.
Right. And then what you can do at that point is a little bit of reduction to absurdity, where you say, well, look, you seem to have this standard for evidence in this one particular case, right? Like when it comes to God, that you don't have like anywhere else in your life, right? You've set the bar really high over here. You've turned the dials way up, and you seem to have turned the dials way down on your skepticism, for example. Yeah.
Is there ever a situation where if let's say like the sun is out, therefore it's daytime, right? And then if the sun's not out, then it is true that it's not daytime. Like if there's like an idea that there is only there is only two answers. It's either yes or no. Like how would you write this? Like,
Yeah, so that falls under kind of what Blaine was saying with the if and only if statement. So in that case, you just gave two, what are they called, synonymous statements. The sun being out and it being daytime, right? That's the same as saying if it's it is daytime if and only if the sun is out, right? Or the sun is out if and only if it's daytime. And they're just like the same statement.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this kind of reasoning breaks down in that case, as well as the next logical fallacy we're going to talk about. A similar thing applies where you have bidirectional statements. Things like if something has 3 sides, it's a triangle. It's like, likewise, if something's a triangle, it has 3 sides. Any other questions? That was a good observation.
Why is it called denying the antecedent again?
Sure. Because the first part of the thing, before the if, right? So if P, then Q. The P there is what we call the antecedent. And the logical form of this argument negates P, or denies the antecedent. And then infers not Q from it.
Thank you.
And the next one's going to be similar. This one is much less of a pain. We go a lot faster with slides. Okay. The similarities in DNA of all organisms on Earth prove that evolution is true. And so there's the way that this argument is formalized is, if evolution were true, I'm just going to do then similarities. Save my wrist a little bit. However, there are similarities. Therefore, evolution true. Okay, so same as last time. If P then Q, Q, therefore P. This is similar to denying the antecedent. Anyone care to guess what this is called?
Not denying the antecedent.
True, but not quite true.
Affirming the consequent.
Affirming the consequent. So rather than denying this and then saying not Q, you're saying, well, Q is true, and so therefore P is true. So you're reversing this if-then arrow. Yeah.
Is there such a thing as denying the consequent?
Yes, there is. And that's actually a valid way of reasoning. And so another way to reason, instead of P, Q, this thing, you could say if P then Q, not Q, which is denying the consequent, therefore not P. So if it is raining outside, the grass will be wet. The grass is not wet, therefore it's not raining outside. And that makes sense, right? Because if it were raining outside, the grass would be wet. That's what this is saying. However, the fact that the grass is not wet proves it's not raining outside. Because if it were, the grass would be wet. But it's not. So yeah, denying the consequent. Okay, so what this is doing, if evolution was true, then you'd have all these similarities. Lo and behold, we see these similarities, and so therefore evolution is true. As far as a logical argument goes, that's fallacious. However, what many of you are probably thinking is, wait, isn't this the kind of thing that we do in science? We create a hypothesis that has some kind of predictive power, right? And we go and we look into the world and we see that those predictions actually came true. And we think, oh, that makes it probably more likely that this theory is true, right? And so we have to remember this is a logical fallacy. It's a little different, or it's in a different category when we're thinking about things like the scientific method. So when you're arguing probabilistically. So it breaks down in that case. So you can't actually prove it deductively, but it does offer some kind of soft support, right? In a similar way, we would say, if for the second premise of the Coulomb cosmological argument, the universe beginning to exist, we would say, if the universe did begin to exist in a Big Bang, then we would expect to see cosmic microwave background radiation. Lo and behold, we actually do see cosmic microwave background radiation, so that kind of offers support for the Big Bang model being true. And so in science, it works out. In logic, it doesn't. Yeah.
Is is this the example of like correlation does not equal causation? Is that like a logic term for that, you know, statistic principle?
They're close siblings. I can say I haven't didn't make that explicit connection, but I assume it's true. Yeah.
Well, because, I mean, the existence of evolution doesn't negate the existence of God, and the existence of a God does not negate the existence of similarities.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think that if evolution is true, then at least like the Christian God described in Scripture is not true, or at the very least, if evolution is true, then the first 11 chapters of Genesis aren't true. Now, whether or not that's actually the case, you can debate, but at least some people believe that. And so usually the person who's using evolution to try to disprove Christianity is one of such person who believes that those two things can't exist at the same time. Anything else?
Can you give a simpler example of denying the consequence or affirming the consequence where it's like obvious, like it's a logical fallacy? I'm still having a little trouble like recognizing this one.
Sure. We'll do the grass wet example again, the good old. So if raining, grass wet. Grass wet, therefore raining. So if it's raining, the grass will be wet. If you then say, well, the grass is wet, therefore it's raining, but you look out, that's not actually the case. If the grass is wet because someone has their sprinklers on, for instance, right? And so you've argued now that, hey, it's raining, when in actuality it's not raining, someone just has their sprinklers on, or a dog's peeing on the grass, right? But yet, the grass is wet.
So are you saying is that there's multiple possibilities for P? So like in the first one, there could be other reasons for the similarities other than evolution?
Exactly,
Okay.
yeah. So the theist would say, well look, God has actually, or these could say, God has designed all of life on Earth, right? And at least human designers, there's similarities that we see in all the different things that they make, right? Like they have like a touch note on the things they create. And so we would also then expect some similarities in all the things God made, right? Because he's a designer on a much larger scale. And so that could at least possibly account for similarities, not necessarily just evolution.
So, sorry, I'm getting confused. So, are you saying that if you get more specific, that this is no longer a fallacious argument? Like, if you said the grass is wet, the method by which was water droplets coming from the sky through clouds, like, could they then say it's raining?
Does it?
If
it is raining,
it's raining, but like, could you make it somehow more specific
I think what it's
enough to where it excludes the possibility of the dog did it, or I don't know, a bucket of water, I don't know.
Sure, you could. In which case, it would still be fallacious to argue that way, but it may still be true. And so we'll get to that in just a second, actually. Actually, I think I'll skip a couple of objections to answer your point. Yeah.
Is it a general rule that affirming the antecedent and then
Denying the antecedent.
Is affirming the antecedent a way of? Because I'm trying to figure out if affirming the antecedent and then what is the second one called?
Denying the consequent.
Yeah, and then denying the consequent, if those are both generally correct, whereas denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent are both generally logical fallacies?
That's correct. Yeah. So affirming the antecedent is just any if-then statement, right? And so that makes sense. But then denying the consequent is one that is also a valid way of arguing. And actually, one of our arguments for the existence of God uses that structure. Does anyone happen to know which one that is? Denying the consequent.
What's the third word?
If objective moral values and duties do not exist. Oh, sorry. Hold on. God does not exist. Then objective moral values and duties do not exist. However, duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Okay. So this is the same structure, but there's some negation thrown in there. So this says, if not P, then not Q. Q, therefore P. So you can tell if you just negate everything, so take away the negation from the P and the Q and then add one to here. You can see it's the same structure, just with negations thrown in. And so this is denying the consequent. So the consequent is a negation of objective moral values and duties do not exist. And so we're taking a negation of that, or the denial of that, to say that but objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. And so that's a logically valid way of arguing. And a more real example of something that uses denying the consequent. Do you guys follow that? The negation throws things off a little bit, but it's the same, reasoning structure under the hood.
If you're using something to argue, like if your Q is something that is not measurable and not something that is generally like completely agreed upon or something like that, then does it still make it logically sound? Because there's some people that think that objective morals and duties don't exist.
Right.
So how could we use this to say that?
Yeah, so there's two characteristics that logical arguments have. There's validity and soundness. So validity is more of what we're talking about here, which just says that the conclusion logically follows from the premises.
Okay.
Soundness is whether or not those premises are true in the first place, right? And so premise one here, you would have to argue for, because someone would say, well, maybe evolution accounts for objective moral values and duties, right? You don't necessarily need God for that.
Yeah.
And as you said, you also would have to defend this. Some people don't believe that objective moral values and duties exist in the first place.
Okay, yeah. So an argument doesn't have to be sound to be valid.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
An argument can be absolutely be logically valid without having any soundness at all. It can have all false premises, but still have the conclusion logically follow from the premises. Okay. So, skipping a couple to talk about what Davis was bringing up. Okay, so there's a fallacy called the fallacy fallacy. It's called the fallacy fallacy. It really is. Look it up. Fallacy fallacy.
Is that like when someone makes a fallacy and you thought they did?
You'll see. Okay, so consider. Is anyone here a mathematician at all? Yeah, just. Okay. Anyone here in STEM? Whatever. If you know any basic math, this will make you explain. Okay. So consider the fraction 16/64, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to just cancel out the 6 from the top and bottom. And what you end up with is 1/4. Hey, stop. Are you telling me 16/64 is not 1/4?
No, it is.
No, it is, right? Yeah. So, true conclusion. Got there completely wrong. Right? So the fallacy is assuming that someone's conclusion is wrong just because they got there in a fallacious way. Right? So someone's conclusion, can be absolutely right, even if they got there wrongly. Right? And so this is helpful for us because, like, let's say someone does, like you present an argument, some argument for the existence of God, right? And let's say they just completely knock that argument down, right? That doesn't mean that your conclusion that God exists is wrong. It just means that your argument doesn't prove that. Right? And so if someone says, like, oh, so therefore God doesn't exist because your argument for its existence doesn't work. That's the fallacy. Right? So it's like saying 16/64 isn't 1/4 because your argument crossing out the sixes to get there doesn't work.
Is it similar to the genetic fallacy in a way that, like, just because that person is, like, has done something or been wrong before, that doesn't mean that their conclusion is wrong?
So that's a slightly different thing what you just said. It's like you said two different things. Saying that, well, look, this person has been wrong in the past, and so therefore they're wrong now.
Yeah.
That's more of an ad hominem where you're now attacking the person rather than what they're actually saying. A genetic fallacy is when you judge something being right or wrong, or true or false, based off of where the idea originates from.
Okay.
And then this is different than both of those in that you're judging it based off of how they got there. So like because someone got there wrongly, therefore it is wrong. This is kind of like the clock twice a day thing, right? Okay, any other questions on the fallacy?
Are you familiar with the Abbott-Costello sketch of 7 times 13 is 28, where he proves it 3 different ways that 7 times 13 is 28? Okay.
I'm not.
Yeah, proves it with like addition, multiplication, and division, but he's not doing any of those actually correctly.
Yeah, and also arriving at a wrong conclusion.
Correct. So I was wondering if there's a name for something like that.
Yeah. All right. So that makes sense. I do want to point out, it is 10 past 8. I know we started a little late, but we normally do end at 8. So if anyone does need to go, I'm giving you my blessing so you have this opportunity to leave.
Blessing.
Without, like, everyone forgetting up in the middle of, the middle of things. Right?
Leave now.
Hopefully it was a little somewhat interesting. You can only make formal logic so interesting. Or just like
Off the dome.
next, here in a couple minutes, we're going to carry on.
Let's tell them that.
Actually, I'm not even thinking it's there yet.
No, I want you to turns out I'm just talking about other ones. Honestly, we're already very, I feel like we're pretty I feel like we're pretty aligned. Yeah, personality-wise
Like I sometimes think of it for the original.
lied about something.
It's not how, apparently it's not how we did it.
I know what you're saying.
Like, not to say.
I promise that it has to do with
Logic is
So,
it's an interesting course.
The Indians from
That's a good way to.
and they are
Okay. Order.
That's genetics, yeah.
Alright, we're back to it. Everyone that's here is to continue on.
Do that teacher club thing.
Is that teacher club? Oh, the
I call that
and see if people mirror it.
Yeah.
well, like it was both.
It's from a certain culture, because you're saying like.
So,
I couldn't tell.
has anyone here heard of Euthro's dilemma? No one here has heard of Euthro's dilemma. Okay, the tonist has heard of Euthro's.
Something.
Okay, sure. Okay, and then Lydia.
I've heard of it, but I forget what it is.
Okay. So, Euthro's dilemma is it goes something like this. Originally, it's because it's from like the time of Plato, but do the gods command things because they are good, or are things good because the gods command it? And so, more in our context, does God command something because it is good, or is something good because God commands it? Because if God commands something because it's good, then that means that there's some concept of goodness that exists outside of God that God is now beholden to. And so he's doing things to be in line with that. But on the other hand, if something is good merely because God commands it, then that makes that good arbitrary. And so we call that the two horns of Euthro's dilemma. And so no matter which one of those two you choose, there's some deficit within the concept of God that you end up running into. And so this one is actually also a fallacy. It's an informal fallacy called a false dilemma, or a false dichotomy. And so what a false dichotomy, or false dilemma tends to do is presents two choices as though they are your only two choices, right? And then makes you choose between them. And what it does is it ignores any other third plus choice. And so, at least in the case of Christian theism, God does not command something because it's good, nor is something good merely because God commands it, but rather, God commands things because He is good. And so I'll elaborate on that a little bit, which is that goodness is actually found and defined by the very nature of God. And God, being perfectly logical, only commands things in line with His own nature. That nature being good, right? So all things that God commands are necessarily good because they're in alignment with His nature. Otherwise, you have some deficit in God where He's doing things inconsistently. Yes, Glenn.
Two things. How is that different than the God, or something being good because God commands it?
Sure. So something is not, so with something being good because God commands it, it's the God commanding it making it good, rather than what I'm saying, which is something is good if it aligns with God's nature. And so while the reason that something being good because God commanding it would be arbitrary is because God then could command anything, right? Even things that are contradictory to one another. On the other hand, if God only commands that which is in alignment with His nature, right, then you actually now have this objective standard or measure that those commands flow out of, right? And the measure that you can actually compare things to.
But we believe in an objective morality, and
Yes.
so you're saying the last thing you said was true,
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So it's neither of the choices that Euthro presents. We're splitting the horns of Euthro's dilemma and saying, well, look, it's actually that God has a perfectly good nature through which His commands flow.
Okay. Also, why is God commanding something, making it good? Why is like the second part of the dilemma? Why is that necessarily bad?
It just makes it arbitrary. Because then, God could command anything in that model.
And so you could command something that contradicts something else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he could, command you, to murder or to not murder, or, to like rape and pillage a village or to not rape and pillage a village. And no matter what he says, it's good, right? And so it really just does become arbitrary because he can command either.
Okay.
Because, like, at least in that understanding, there's no standard to compare anything against. It's just anything God says, that's what's good.
Okay.
Which is not the Christian conception of it. It's whatever aligns with God's nature, that's what's good.
So just like
Yeah, and like our nature and the things we say are two different things. Right? Similar for God. Yeah.
So is that implying that not everything God commands is good?
No, it is, but it flows out of the proper understanding of God's nature being perfectly good.
Okay, so if God is perfect, then...
Yeah, everything that God commands is good, but that is a result of God having a perfectly good nature. It's a mix of God having a perfectly good nature and also God being completely self-consistent, right? So those two things put together result in commands that are necessarily good.
If I could add a bit of context, if God commanded something arbitrarily and that's what made it good, you have what you have in Islam, where you have like one commandment and then something later on is the opposite, but just because Muhammad said he got a revelation from God, now it's the new standard, right? So it's just kind of whatever he says.
Okay, so we have a few more of these. Okay, so I mentioned the problem of evil would come up, so that's the next one. So if God is all-powerful and all good, then there would be no evil. However, there is evil, and so God is either not all-powerful, not all good, or just doesn't exist at all. I'm sure you all have heard that line of reasoning by now. Has anyone not heard that line of reasoning? That's actually important for me to know, because then it'll, the argument has a little bit more force when you hear it the first time than when you hear it for the utmost time. All right, brilliant. So, the problem with this argument. Has anyone heard of a philosopher by the name of Alvin Plantinga? Anyone else? So Alvin Plantinga is the probably foremost living Christian philosopher in the world right now. And he has done a lot of work on the problem of evil to take away or at least the logical problem of evil, to take away its force. And so what he points out here is that there's actually a hidden premise that the person who's arguing this makes. And it's in the first premise, where it says, if God is all-powerful and all good, there would be no evil. What they're assuming there is that God does not have any morally justifiable reasons for allowing evil to occur. Right? And so what you would then should ask them is, how do you know that? How do you know that it is impossible that God has morally justifiable reasons for allowing evil to occur? This being that's omniscient, in control of everything, he had no good reason for doing that. Right?
Would that be an example of a valid argument but one that's not sound?
In this case, it's
Because it would be generic
yes, yeah. In this case, yes, not sound. So this is a valid argument. They'd be saying if P, then not Q. So if God exists, no evil. However, there is evil, so denying the consequence. Therefore, the problem here is that this first premise is not necessarily true. So that if God is all-powerful and all good, there would be no evil. The reason for that is what they're doing is taking a burden of proof, is what we call it, upon themselves, that they cannot actually bear. And so the burden of proof is they're saying, look, it's impossible for God to have any morally justifiable reason to allow evil. But there's no way that you could actually prove that, right? Because all you would need to prove that statement wrong is to give, one mere possibility, for like any possible reason why God allowed any evil to occur, to show that there was at least a possible reason. But they're saying it's impossible. There is no possible reason. And so this is the reason that the logical problem of evil no longer really exists in academia. It's pretty much been wiped out. It's not really in papers anymore or anything else because people recognize that you can't actually support that first premise.
I'm sorry, would you mind writing this out on the board? Like
The whole argument?
Yeah.
Sure. Get rid of this nonsense there. All right. So, if God exists, then no evil. However, there is evil, therefore God does not exist. Or isn't all powerful or all good, but the conception of God we're talking about is all powerful and all good. So if you get rid of one of those, God doesn't exist. Yeah, that's the argument. And so this first premise is incredibly hard, if not impossible, to actually defend. And since they're the one making the argument, they're the one with the burden of proof to support their premise, if they can't actually support their premise, then they can't support their conclusion. Okay, so that's the problem of evil, at least the logical problem. That being said, I'm jumping away from the logic for a second. There is also what I will call the emotional problem of evil, which is when someone comes to you and says, hey, look, I can't believe that God exists, or that God's all good, because of all this atrocious stuff that has happened to me personally, right? To that person, you do not, just as a practical note, you do not reply by attacking the logical problem of evil. Because they're not really thinking of it that way at all. They have a much deeper issue that they're grappling with. And so that's something that really is handled more on a pastoral level, like a relational level, than it is like a logical argument, right? And so just as a word of like caution, people are not just robots. You can explain to them, well, hey, look, the logical problem of evil doesn't work and all that kind of stuff, and then like you've completely missed the mark, right? And so normally when people bring up a problem of evil, you should really ask a few questions to figure out, well, like, out of all the objections that you just could have given, why'd you give that one exactly? They might be some hoity-toity academic, in which case they're talking about a logical problem, but very well they could not be. So it's actually more likely than not, they're not. So, word of caution. Okay. Where is... Okay, so here's an interesting one. This one's a little more complicated. The wording is really obnoxious, is really what I'm trying to get at. Glenn, this is one that you and I have talked about before. So, it's usually, this argument is in the form of a question. If God knows the future, then how is it that you actually have free will? Right? And so, I'm going to write out the actual argument that they're trying to get at. So necessarily, if God foreknows X, X will happen. God foreknows X, and this X is where it can be your free choice, right? So therefore, X will happen necessarily. All right. That's the argument they're making. Necessarily, like it's absolutely necessarily true that if God foreknows X, that X will happen. That's true, right? God can't foreknow something that never happens, because then there's nothing to foreknow. Then God would just be wrong. God's omniscient, God can't be wrong. First premise is true. So then let's say X is any of your free will choices. God knows that, right? Therefore, X will happen necessarily. But if your free will choice happened necessarily, what it means for something to be necessary is that it couldn't have been any other way. But if your free will choice couldn't have been any other way, right, that you couldn't have chosen differently, that means you don't have free will. Okay, so this, there's a logical fallacy in this. And it's what is called confusing the necessity of the consequence with the necessity of the consequent. And that's why the language is confusing. Okay. This part down here is the consequence. This is the consequent. So, necessarily, if God foreknows X, X will happen, right? And X will happen necessarily, like it has to happen. God foreknows X, and therefore X will happen. What's not true about this is that X will happen necessarily. All you can prove from this, necessarily if God foreknows X, X will happen. If God foreknows X, all you can prove is this part right here, that X will happen. That part's not true. Well, and so a simpler way to understand this is, let's say for any given speaker, if a given speaker says, if the speaker says, I exist, right, then, and necessarily they exist, right? It is actually true that they exist. However, that does not mean that they exist necessarily, right? They very well could not have existed and not be there in the first place to utter the statement, right? So they don't exist necessarily, they exist contingently. However, if they say I exist, like if any speaker says I exist, it is necessarily that they actually do exist, because otherwise they have to exist to say it. But they don't exist necessarily. Is that confusing enough for everyone? Yes? Do you still understand it, though? The underlying thing. And so when it comes to at least God's foreknowledge, here's a good little thought experiment for you. Anyone that's heard me say this one before, but the infallible barometer, just ignore me. You can tune out for the next 2 minutes. So everyone know what a barometer is? Instrument for predicting the weather, right? So let's assume you have an infallible barometer. It's a barometer that cannot be wrong. And you ask of the barometer, hey barometer, in 15 years, what will the weather be like in Spain? And the barometer spits out that in 15 years on this day, it will rain in Spain. And you're like, okay, noted. And you write it on your calendar. Digital calendar, because physical is over that far. 15 years go by, and you're visiting Spain on vacation. And lo and behold, it's raining in Spain on that day. Right? Because the infallible barometer said so. Now here's the question. Did the barometer, this instrument for predicting the weather, did the barometer cause it to rain in Spain on that day? No. Right? It just knew that it would. But there's no causal relationship that necessitated it would rain in Spain on that day. It very well could have not rained in Spain on that day. The barometer would have said bright skies, sunny skies. Similarly, just because God foreknows the free choices you will make, or let's just take out the word free, choices you will make, does not mean that he is causing the choices that you will make. Right? And so which means that those choices are not made necessarily. In which case they want to be choices. Okay. So that's the most confusing of the logical fallacies. And that's a logical fallacy in what we call modal logic, the logic of necessity and possibilities. Austin.
Can you explain how that's a fair analogy, since like God would have the power to change the weather? Like a barometer doesn't have the power to change the weather, right? So necessarily it has to be some kind of foreknowledge. But God would have the power to change the weather if he so wanted to. So he does not have the option.
Yes, if he wanted to, yeah.
Right.
The point of that analogy is to show that the mere foreknowledge isn't enough to get you there. You then need to pair that foreknowledge with something else, and then you can possibly get there, right? But what their argument is from is, hey, just given God's foreknowledge and that's it. You know, you don't have free will. You'd have to. There's more argumentation that would have to be done to get to that point. Okay. Yes.
So are you saying that if you include after, like, so if God foreknows X and God has the ability to control X, X will happen according to his will.
And God chooses to exercise that ability.
Or chooses to not exercise it.
Or not exercise it, sure.
But he...
Yeah, I mean, at that point, what you're saying is, if God causes you to do X, you will do X.
But if he also doesn't cause me to not do X, I will not do X.
Sorry, you mean if he causes you to not do X, then you won't do X?
No, if he, like, decides to not act. So, like...
So, again, hold on. Let's stop it there. So I see what you're saying. And it's a good example of one of the fallacies.
Okay.
So,
Gotta catch him.
yep, if God
Oh, I see.
causes me to do X,
Yeah, I see.
I do X. Right? However, if, let's just call it P. I like Q. If he doesn't cause me to do X, therefore, is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that he's not... Okay, let's say that I was intending on going to Target tomorrow.
Okay.
And God, like, for some reason, God does not want me to go to Target tomorrow. Then let's say, like, he makes my car, like, break down or something, and I'm unable to get to Target.
Sure.
Or, like, let's say that he did want me to go to Target, and that he doesn't cause my car to break down. In that case, he's...
Doesn't cause, so as in he causes your car not to break down.
Okay, yes. He does,
Yeah.
yeah.
So he basically, he doesn't stop you from going.
Exactly.
Okay.
But I'm still, like, his influence, or even lack thereof, of not causing my car to break down,
Sure.
is still influencing my decision.
Sure.
Because he had the ability to let me not make that decision.
Yeah, so like if you were about to get up and walk out of the room, and I don't stop you from getting up and walking out of the room, did I cause you to get up and walk out of the room?
If you were able to stop me from walking out of the room, then yes.
I still caused you to do it?
What? Okay, I see what you're saying.
I mean, your decision to get up and walk up and get out of the room is what caused you to get up and get out of the room. I had nothing to do with it. Yeah.
You caused me, you played a part in me leaving the room. You didn't play a part in me, like, getting up out of my chair and walking towards the door.
I'll put it this way, there's no causal chain that you can draw from me doing nothing to you getting up and walking out of the room, such that you could say that caused that.
But you still, like, had control over it and didn't act over it. It's like...
Yes, which is a different thing.
Okay. But I guess, like, I'm sort of, like, comparing God to, like, a bystander and, like, not doing anything. And, like, letting something happen. And so, like, he's indirectly causing it when he has every ability to stop something.
Not even indirectly causing it. Indirect cause would be me throwing a brick at someone's window, breaking the window, and now they need to pay to get the window fixed, and therefore miss a mortgage payment and get evicted out of their house. In that case, I'm indirectly causing them to be evicted.
It's like a chain of events.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's an indirect cause. Because I didn't evict the person, right? I didn't even like cause them to be evicted. I indirectly got to cause them to be evicted.
Okay. Okay. I see what you're
If
saying.
you had the,
It's like
if you had the power to pay the mortgage, but didn't do anything about it, that wouldn't cause them
To be evicted, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. There's a good parallel, like formulating in my mind about hell, where it's like, I'll let that sit.
Yeah, I mean, you can parallel it with God. Like, did he cause evil, right? Because if I go out and commit a theft tomorrow, God could have theoretically stopped me from stopping my car before I committed the theft.
Right.
Is the lack of him stopping me from starting the car, him caused me to then do theft? Well, that's not really true. I still had my own will and prerogative to do the theft.
Yeah.
He just didn't stop me from doing the theft. But the fault and responsibility is still on my own, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So in that case, you're the cause of the evil.
Right. Just because he didn't put a roadblock up doesn't mean that he caused it. He just didn't stop it.
I guess like what I'm getting at is like God's not causing it, but he's still like at least marginally responsible for it. Is that like still?
Yeah, I mean, to say he's responsible, what is?
I feel like he's trying to say like, I feel like he's getting at what it is.
Sorry about myself.
Like, at what point does our agency and free will take over and God's like domain of responsibility like end? It's like you could make the argument like God's responsible for like anything that happens because he created us or something and created the universe. So by definition, I pick up this cup. God's indirectly responsible for this because he created everything. Like, I think he's trying to.
Yeah, I guess it kind of depends
like,
what we mean
the
by
domain of responsibility. Like, at what point does our agency do we become responsible and not God?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess it depends what we mean by responsible, right? And so when we say a common way we use the phrase is like, let's say someone doesn't do something they were supposed to do, and we say to them, well, look, you have a responsibility over that. Right? Like, let's say, like, taking care of my son. If I just let him starve to death. Someone could rightly look at me and say, look, you have a responsibility that you didn't actually, fulfill. Like, you were responsible for this and you didn't do it. What we call that, another way to frame that is we call those moral duties, right? And so moral duties arise, this is, might be getting into some broader territory, but this is more of what we call divine command theory, which is that moral values and duties arise from the commands of some competent authority, right? So if you think about all the responsibilities and all the duties you have, there's some authority above you that gave you those duties, right? So you have a duty to them to do that thing. So an interesting thing, I forget who it exists, that actually points it out historically, but what they point out is that God does not actually have any moral duties because there is no one to whom he is responsible, right? And so when we look at God and say, hey, look, you are responsible for stopping such and such evil, right? We're kind of implying that he has a moral duty to do those things, which is something we can't actually say. So it depends what we mean by responsibility.
Could we say he has like moral duties, like to himself, like to his own nature?
Yeah, we could say that he has to act consistently with his own nature.
Yeah,
for sure. But then that gets back to the whole problem of evil thing, which is that, well, what if God has morally justifiable reasons for allowing some evil to occur, right? Then in that case, he actually has, we still can't say duty or responsibility, but he still has good reason for not stopping that thing, right?
So would it be fair to say that if God does not act, then it's simply a lack of knowledge on our part of where God's moral duties to act consistently with himself end. And that it's our moral duty, in a sense, not his.
I mean, you could say
Okay.
that. I'm having a little difficulty framing the whole like his duties ending, our duty beginning thing.
Like, I
I'm
guess
not sure
I'm
how to-
operating under the assumption that, like, if God determined everything, like, everything I did was determined or caused by God,
Like, two
then
different things.
caused, then,
Okay, if everything you do is caused by God, right? Then that means even that the evil you do is caused by God, and you actually don't have free will in this case.
yeah,
right?
exactly. So I'm
Yes.
saying his moral duties would, I don't want to say necessarily, but like, would be, it would encompass a greater number of things than the existence of free will, whereas his moral duties would shrink, in essence, like, because the existence of our own free will.
Yeah, so I guess
Like,
what
God,
I'm trying to say is there are a lot of things that happen in the world, right? And if free will exists, then a lot less things, then the set of things that happen that God caused is smaller, right?
right,
Then if free will doesn't exist, then, you know, the list of things that happen and the things that God caused, that's a circle. There's no Venn diagram there, right? It's just one big circle.
yeah.
That's true, yeah.
That's like where I was drawing the line, where the duties, the whole like separation thing, it's like the existence of our free will versus no free will.
Yeah, and so I guess if you're sitting there trying to separate them, like, well, how do we know what things God causes and what things we cause?
Yeah, is that simply, so is that a knowledge issue on our part, like a?
Oh, no, not necessarily. I think the things that we cause, if you believe that we actually do have free will, are things that the causal chain goes back and terminates at our decision to act, right? And then if it terminates there, then that means you can't then extend it back to something God caused. At that point, it's something you caused. And so you can distinguish them that way, right? Say like, well, where does the causal chain end? If it ends at God, it's something God caused. If it ends at us, it's something we caused. That make sense?
Yeah.
Does that get at your question?
That wasn't quite what I understand, so I'm not going to beat the dead horse.
Sure. Okay. Sorry, the misunderstanding is probably on my side, not yours.
Yeah.
It's happened a few times tonight. Okay. And one last one that we'll talk about. Isn't the Trinity a contradiction? Because, how can God be one and three at the same time? Right? You're welcome. So this is a bit of a primer for next week where Sarah will be talking about it. This is just another example of equivocation where they're talking about, because when we're talking about the Trinity, we're talking about one in one sense and three in a completely different sense. We're talking about one in being and three in personhood, and they're equivocating the one and three to mean the same. And so in that case, you would have a contradiction, but because we mean it in different senses, then it's not. Because a contradiction is just two things that are true at the same, both true and false at the same time and in the same sense, but we mean it in different senses, so therefore it's not a contradiction. Okay, that's all I got.